Welcome to DCB's College Football Preview. It's episode 2, and we're talking about the Big Ten today. First things first, before we get into it, head over to x.com, or formerly known as Twitter, as I still often call it. Shoot me a follow at Daily CFB CBB. I'll be posting every single one of the futures bets that I lock in via these podcasts, as well as our week-to-week bets on the games themselves. The Big Ten is host to the last 2 national titles. 2 years ago, it was Michigan, and then last year, the Ohio State Buckeyes. In the first year of the 12-team college football playoff, able to go on really a gauntlet of a run and claim their first national championship in a decade. Ohio State went through Tennessee, Oregon, Texas, and Notre Dame on the way to winning that title, but they also lost 2 regular season games, a tight one on the road at Oregon, and for the 4th straight season, and a nail-biter at home to Michigan. Michigan had a walk-on quarterback in that game, former walk-on, who threw for 62 yards, and Ohio State still lost that game. So there's 2 ways to look at this team. Obviously, they went on that incredible run. I'm taking nothing away from that. Ryan Day proved a lot of doubters wrong and able to win a lot of big games. But that Michigan game is still a big one for the folks down in Columbus, and he's got to win it this year. They're actually in a very similar position as Michigan was last year, coming off of the title. They lost quite a few pieces, not quite as much in the staff category as Michigan did, as Jim Harbaugh, the head coach, obviously left and took most of his assistants with him to the NFL. Ryan Day does return, but he's got 2 new coordinators, including Matt Patricia as his defensive coordinator. For my NFL fans, definitely some doubts there, at least for me, heading into the season for that defense, who also lost a ton of talent as far as individual players go. Both edge rushers and JT Tuimoloau and Jack Sawyer, both really impact players. A bunch of picks all across this roster, 14 of them in total, draft picks out of Ohio State. They lost 15 transfers as well. Got to replace a lot of key positions on the offense as well. QB Will Howard wasn't always the greatest, but he did lead them on that national title run and was a real run threat. Is Julian Sayin going to be able to step in and do that same thing for this offense? Not sure. He doesn't have much experience, obviously never started in college, but that is the case for most of these powerhouse programs this season in college football. So a lot of things up in the air for this program. Tons of talent across the board. We know they recruit at an elite level. Top 5 classes 4 straight years, a top 10 transfer portal class last year, leading into the title run, of course. They are number 2 on the blue chip ratio, so eligible to win another national championship this year. I just don't see it, though. I think outside of Jeremiah Smith on offense, I think there's a lot of question marks at the skill positions. They do bring in a tight end from Purdue, Max Clare, definitely an impact starter right away. But the running back position is a big question mark, the offensive line, and then the defensive line in particular, I think is the weakness for this team. Not a lot of size and not that much depth, I think, at least in terms of quality depth. I think there's a pathway to losing some games this season for Ohio State. They've been in double-digit wins 18 of the last 20 seasons, and one of the 2 that wasn't was the COVID year. They didn't even play enough games to be eligible. So this team is a consistent 10-plus year in and year out. You can pretty much bank on that, but I see a pathway to 9-3 here with this schedule. They open with Texas. That game is at home week 1, but I personally lean pretty strongly towards the Horns in that one. And then they've got Penn State coming in there. We'll talk about them next in week 10. And then they got to go to the Big House in the last week of the season to try and break that 4-game losing streak to Michigan. So I see a pathway to them losing all 3 of those games if they don't have things tinkered with on that offense. And I just don't know if the 2 coordinators are going to gel right away with Day's leadership. So I see some challenges for Ohio State, especially early on in the season. They do get some easier games after Texas to kind of get warmed up before we get into the meat of conference play. But Ohio State overall, I think, is due for a little bit of regression after the title last year. I see them going either 9-3 or 10-2. Let's go to Penn State, second in the odds this year to win the Big Ten. People probably scoff at that, a lot of you, and that's because James Franklin is the head coach of this team. He doesn't exactly have the greatest track record in big games. Year after year, it seems like Penn State is just close to the top, but haven't been able to make it over the hump since 2016, their last Big Ten championship. If it's going to happen again, though, it's going to be this year, I believe. While they did lose their best player on each side of the ball in Abdul Carter as an edge rusher and Tyler Warren as a tight end, they still return a top 30 unit in terms of production across the country. They are very close on the blue chip ratio, not quite on the list, but number 12 overall in terms of 4 and 5-star recruits on the roster. And just a lot of key returning players at important positions. Drew Aller, third year as a starter. Nick Singleton and Katron Allen have been there forever as the running back pairing. They've got a very experienced, very good offensive line. They still have good edge rushers, including Dennis Sutton, who should step in right away for Abdul Carter and his production off the edge. And then what I really love about this team is they hit the transfer portal, but not just willy-nilly just grabbing players to fill across their roster. They saw a specific need that they needed to target, which was wide receiver, and they brought in 3 guys that are going to make a huge impact right away. Devontae Ross was a 1,000-yard guy at Troy. Obviously a step up in competition for him, but he's already probably the best receiver on the roster from a year ago. Trebor Pena from Syracuse, another impact guy, over 800 yards a year ago in a major conference. And then Kyron Hudson from USC is a big-bodied target that will give them yet another weapon on the outside. So Penn State hasn't been able to stretch the field in quite some time, and that's really been the one thing missing from their offense. But in year 2, under offensive coordinator Andy Kotelnicki, who came over from an explosive offense in Kansas a year ago, I think that things are going to gel very well, and Penn State's going to be very explosive on that side of the ball. Obviously, they don't always need to be. They can really hammer that run game with Allen and Singleton as much as they need, and the defense is always going to be there in the back pocket. They also made a real old-school move on that side of the ball, poaching defensive coordinator Jim Knowles from Ohio State after he won the championship. Huge move from them. So Penn State, very high on this year. It's always scary backing James Franklin, and I know I'm going to hear about it from a lot of people at the end of the season if things don't work out, but I'm a Penn State believer this year. I'll be buying them to win the Big Ten. I'll probably jump in on over 10.5 wins as well. The schedule has 2 key games on it. That's against Oregon at home in week 5. That's a game Oregon has to travel across the country to. It'll be the first big game for their new starter, Dante Moore. We'll talk about them next. And then at Ohio State in week 10. Those are the 2 games that are going to decide Penn State's season. If they can win both, there's definitely a pathway to them being undefeated. If they can split them, they'll still be probably 11-1 and in the Big Ten championship game. So I love how things set up for them. They do play Indiana and Nebraska both at home as well. So not a lot of concerns with the schedule. I think there's a decent chance they get Ohio State this year, and then Oregon coming to town there. They're going to be one of the biggest games of the season. So loving this setup for Penn State. I love everything that they return. I love the narrative that James Franklin can't win big games. He hasn't in the past, but that doesn't mean he can't in the future. So give me a bunch of Penn State stock this season. How about the Big Ten champions of last year, and that's the Oregon Ducks, a team that went 12-0 in the regular season and then immediately crashed out in the playoffs, getting demolished by Ohio State and really embarrassed on the national stage. How is Oregon going to bounce back this year with a new quarterback in Dante Moore? Has some limited experience starting in his freshman year at UCLA, where I thought his struggles were due to much more of the offensive line than it was his issues. I still think he's a very talented quarterback, but I think he fits in well with this Oregon offense. It probably will take some time to gel, but a lot of question marks across this Oregon roster. 10 draft picks off of it, including a pair of first rounders, one on each side of the ball in the trenches, with Derek Harmon as a D tackle and Josh Connerly Jr. on the offensive line. They lost weapons like Tez Johnson and Terrence Ferguson, but they have done an incredible job of reloading their roster every year as well. 3 seasons, all in the top 10 in high school recruiting, and 2 excellent transfer portal classes, number 2 overall last year and then number 5 this year. I actually think this transfer portal class may have more impact players, though. Running back Mekhi Hughes comes over from Tulane. He is the active leader in touchdowns across college football. They bring in a couple of big time offensive linemen, Isaiah World from Nevada and Emmanuel Pregnon from USC. They bring in some impact defenders as well, such as Dylan Thieneman from Purdue. That being said, there's so many question marks across this offense, especially after Evan Stewart, their top receiver, went down with a knee injury late in spring. I think that's really going to hamper them as they go into the early part of this season. They do have one of the best freshmen in the country coming in as well in Decorian Moore. He's the number one receiver in this class and has elite speed. If he's anything like DeAnthony Thomas, then I will change my tune on this offense. I'm in a little bit of a pickle here personally. I haven't posted too many futures bets, but when I was driving through Ohio, I did log into my Bet365 account, which I don't have access to in my state, and I placed a couple that I posted. One of those was a parlay of a couple of teams to make the playoffs, just a small, fun wager, and that did include Oregon. After looking into the team a little bit more, I'm not as convinced that this is a playoff team. I think there is going to be some significant regression from that 12-0 year. I would lean towards the under on the 10.5 win total. That being said, Dan Lanning is one of the better young coaches in the sport. I think he's got a great offensive coordinator in Will Stein, and I think they'll do enough to still get to around 9 or 10 wins. But as is the case with all of these teams, so much of it comes back to the quarterback position. If Dante Moore can't fit in seamlessly, it's going to be rough early on, and they don't really have a ton of experienced backup options either. So it's pretty much ride or die with Dante Moore, and we'll see where Oregon ends up. Next up is Michigan. 2 seasons ago, as I mentioned at the top of this podcast, coming away with a national championship. Last year, a little bit of a rough year. Most people expected the team to have to reload a little with Jim Harbaugh and his entire staff bolting for the LA Chargers. They had 13 NFL draft picks that season and 7 more last year, so a ton of talented pieces to replace for new head coach Sharon Moore, now in his second season. Wink Martindale is there for year number 2 as the DC. They bring in Chip Lindsey as the offensive coordinator, though, and I'm excited to see what he can do. The offense has been a little bit stagnant. Even in the title-winning year, it wasn't exactly an explosive offense. There were some plays generated by J.J. McCarthy's incredible arm talent and just Roman Wilson being fast, but Michigan hasn't really schemed open guys in the passing game in quite some time, so they're hoping that Chip Lindsey, who's had experience across the spectrum of college football, coaching rather explosive offenses in the South, now comes up north and hopefully can add some explosiveness to this Michigan unit. As I said, they lost 7 draft picks, both of the D tackles, Mason Graham and Kenneth Grant, probably the best pair of interior linemen in the country, so that's always difficult to replace, but Michigan has guys in the front 7. That's probably the most loaded group for this team. They've done a good job in ramping up the recruiting from number 16 2 years ago. Now they bring in the number 6 class this year and are actually ranked higher heading into next season as of right now. So the talent has been building up in the 2 years that Moore has been the head coach. But once again, we go back to the quarterback position, where right now it's officially still a battle, but we all know that Bryce Underwood, the true freshman, is likely to be the starter here. That being said, they did bring in some help after the spring window and transferred quarterback Jake Garcia, so maybe that's an indication that Underwood's not entirely ready. Didn't have a great spring game, I would say, having been there, it was just as much on the receivers than it was on him. But speaking of receivers, they do bring in a couple of transfers that I'm excited to see. Donovan McCulley comes over from Indiana, and then Anthony Simpson is a guy from UMass who I'm skeptical of a little bit more, but McCulley, I'm expecting to have a very productive year. The tight ends are always good at Michigan, and they really like the running back pairing with Justice Hayes, a transfer from Alabama, and Jordan Marshall, a kid who doesn't have much experience but got to play in the bowl game last year and was a real impact guy. The schedule is interesting this year as they open up with a couple of easy ones at home in weeks 1 and 3, but in between, they've got a road trip to Oklahoma. That's going to be a night game, and OU, we talked about in the SEC pod, they've got some impact transfers on the offensive side in quarterback John Mateer and running back Jaden Ott. Going to be a real challenge for that Michigan defense going on the road, as well as Underwood if he is the starter. That's going to be a crazy environment for him to play his second ever college football game. They've also got road games at Nebraska, at USC, at Michigan State, which is never easy, and then home games against Washington and Ohio State, obviously, to end the year. I actually think this schedule is pretty difficult for Michigan standards. Back when the Big Ten didn't have the West Coast teams and there were divisions, it was a little easier year to year on the schedule, and the non-conference often didn't include a road trip to Oklahoma. So as much as I'm a biased Michigan fan, I actually lean towards the under on the win total at 9.5. It is juiced pretty solidly to the under. I don't think they'll go much lower than that. I'd expect maybe 9-3, 8-4, a small step up from the 7-5 a year ago. But the schedule is going to be tough, and the lack of experience at quarterback is a big question mark. If Bryce Underwood is a Heisman candidate immediately, then this completely changes. But I am tentatively lower on Michigan than the market heading into the season. Next up is USC. Hard to really describe how disappointing the season was a year ago for the Trojans. Lincoln Riley, I would say, is solidly on the hot seat coming into this year. USC led in every single game last year and often deep into the second half, but ended up 7-6, 6-6 in the regular season. Just choked a ton of leads, even to teams that they clearly had a huge talent advantage over. And they're going to have more talent than most of the teams that they played this year, too. But is it going to pay off? I will say I do love the recruiting. The last 3 years, the classes have all been in the top 20. They've been in the top 20 in the transfer portal as well. A couple of those portal guys that they bring in this year, 2 running backs. Eli Sanders from New Mexico, I think will be very good. And then Waymond Jordan from JUCO. Not a highly touted name, but hearing very good things out of camp there from USC. Quarterback position is a question mark. Jaden Mayava didn't look amazing in the bowl game, did get them the win, but some turnover questions certainly coming into this year. I thought Miller Moss actually did a really good job for them last year. It just didn't work out for whatever reason. As I said, they led in most of the games in the second half. They just couldn't close out. Something about the team gelling together just didn't work. But year 2 for defensive coordinator DeAnton Lynn, I actually think this is going to be one of the better defensive units in the Big Ten, which is not something we are used to saying about USC. But I have a lot more questions about the offensive side of the ball than I do on defense, which is probably a good sign for them, as Lincoln Riley, as much as he has some valid criticisms about his success over the past couple of years, he's a great play caller, and that's the one thing you can't doubt about him. So if he can make this offense work, I think they'll be just fine because the defense is the best it's been in a while. The schedule is not too hard. They don't play Ohio State. They don't play Penn State. They do go to Oregon late in the season. They play at Notre Dame in the non-conference, so that's never easy. But 7.5, it is juiced very solidly to the over, so not a ton of value, but I have USC projected at either 9-3 or 8-4. Next up is Nebraska. Once a proud program in college football, over the past few years, they have just really struggled in these close games, very similar to USC. Ended up 7-6 a year ago, which was an improvement. They finally broke the streak of seasons not going to a bowl game. Matt Rule now comes into year 3, and this is typically when his programs start to take flight. Is that going to be the case here with Nebraska? It remains to be seen. Top 25 recruiting classes the past 3 seasons. They bring in the number 13 transfer portal class this year. They also lose 38 transfers. I will say not a ton of them were impact guys, maybe 4 or 5 defenders. They did lose some edge rushers that they're probably going to struggle to replace. Not a lot of depth on the defensive line. But outside of that, The turnover, I think, was generally a good thing for this team. They pick up a couple of really good receivers, and Isaiah Hunter from Cal and Dane Key in particular from Kentucky. Dylan Raiola, though, is he going to be able to take that next step up? I think the cosplaying of Mahomes has got to go. It's just not benefiting him. He's got to be his own quarterback and make a stamp on this program the way that he wants. It just seems like more of a distraction than anything. So Raiola, up and down freshman year, but I like that they threw him on the field immediately and just let him make his mistakes. I think he'll clean some of that up this year. Generally higher on Nebraska than the market. Again, another win total sitting at 7.5, juice to the over. I'm not going to bet it though, because it's just impossible to trust this program until I've seen it with my own two eyes. They've come into seasons with a relative amount of hype before, and it just has been way too long since they've come through. So lean to the over, but I'm going to be passing on this one. Next up is Iowa. This team has really become essentially a meme in this conference. They are elite defensively every single season, but the offense just continues to hold them back. Can that be different this year? That's really the only question that we need to be asking with this team. We know the defense is going to be good. They always have at least a couple of NFL players across the offensive line. They've got a good tight end in Addison Ostrenga. These are all things you're used to hearing about Iowa. But are they going to be able to score some more points? They do bring in a transfer quarterback, Mark Gronowski from South Dakota State, which is a FCS program that has had a ton of success over the past couple of decades. He's been a big part of that the past couple of years. I just don't know that his play style really fits in with this Iowa team. He's much more of a running quarterback, a lot of designed runs for him at South Dakota State. You really don't see that at all at Iowa. But maybe we will. Maybe offensive coordinator Tim Lester will be able to break free from the old school ways of doing things when Kirk Ferentz still had his son calling plays. I would like to think that this offense will take a little bit of a step up, but then again, they lose their running back, Caleb Johnson, who was really the entire force of the unit last year. He was a third-round pick in the NFL. I don't know that they have the guys to replace him, so even if Gronowski is an upgrade at quarterback, it may not make that much of a difference in the end. So early on, they have to play Iowa State. That's a yearly rivalry game. That's a swing game that will really determine how good this team will be, I think, very early on. But a lot of really challenging conference games as well. Several of them are at home. They get both Penn State and Oregon coming into Kinnick, but have to travel to USC and Nebraska, both late in the season. We know the cold doesn't bother Iowa like some of those West Coast teams, but those will still both be very challenging games. The 7.5 win total for them is juiced pretty solidly to the under. Some books even have it at 6.5, but I would prefer to play the under 7.5 if I had to, gun to the head. I just don't love fading Kirk Ferentz. I think he's a solid coach. He hasn't exactly changed much with the times, but he's been so solid throughout his career that it's hard to take an under at 7.5 with as consistent of a program as Iowa has been. Next up is Indiana, a team that made the playoffs last year and yet are still this low down on the list of teams in the odds. It doesn't make much sense to me, but the narratives last year I thought were pretty disrespectful as well. The two losses that they had on an 11-2 season for Indiana football were to Ohio State and Notre Dame, the two teams that played in the national championship. Year one under head coach Curt Cignetti couldn't have gone much better for Indiana, which is a program that's not used to winning too much, but he changed the culture immediately and brought both of his coordinators with him. Both of those guys are still there, along with the core of the roster that transferred over from James Madison. A lot of focus has been on the quarterback situation, with Curtis Rourke moving on as a 7th-round draft pick and replacing him with Fernando Mendoza from California, but I feel like more of the focus has been on the loss of Rourke than the addition of Mendoza. Personally, from what I've seen from him, I love the way this Mendoza kid plays, and I think his ceiling is a lot higher than Rourke's. Rourke wasn't even healthy for a good portion of the season last year, and Indiana won a lot of games in spite of that. So I think there's potential for this team to be better this year. Obviously, part of the success last year was having an easy schedule, and that will not be the case this year. They have road games at Oregon, at Penn State. They go to Iowa, but they host Illinois in week 4, and that's going to be a real big swing game. I think if they can win that and defend home territory, they'll be well on their way to another very successful season. They bring in the number 22 transfer portal class, including, as I said, Mendoza from Cal, Roman Hemby, an impact running back from Maryland, another Big Ten team, jumps ship and comes over to Indiana. They bring in a productive tight end in Holden Stace, and they've got some really good receivers back with Elijah Surratt leading the group. The defense has stars at every level. D'Angelo Pons at the corner spot, Aiden Fisher at the linebacking spot, and then Tyreek Tucker in the middle of the defensive line. They've got good edge rushers as well. So the roster on paper has the potential to be just as good, if not better, than last year. This win total is at 8.5, but it's juiced slightly to the under. I still lean to the over. I think this Indiana team is very good. I think they're a 9-3 caliber team, even if they lose all 3 of those road games. And I think this team is being a little disrespected. I know it's Indiana, and the knee-jerk reaction is to fade them because they're not a football program. But Cignetti has changed the culture, I think, permanently, and I think there's not going to be as much of a drop-off this year as many expect. Next up is Illinois, a team many may be surprised to find this low on the odds list after a 10-3 year, beating South Carolina, who was nearly a playoff team in the bowl game, and bringing back a top 3 returning production roster, including top 7 on both sides of the ball. However, when you look deeper into this team, the talent really isn't there. Even though they bring back a lot of players from a relatively good team, I think they were able to take advantage of a lot of close games that went their way last year. 6-1 in one possession games. But recruiting ranking wise, they've been in the mid 40s throughout the past 4 years, bringing in the number 46 class this past cycle. They've been in the 40s in the transfer portal rankings as well. So despite not losing that many players, I think that Illinois is getting a little bit too much hype, and the books are not really matching the hype from the commentators. Overall, this is the number 41 roster in terms of 4 and 5 star recruits percentage wise. So a mid-table result is really what I'm expecting here, with an increase in schedule difficulty. They go to Duke in week 2, which I think is a bit of a sleeper team in the ACC. They also have another road game at Indiana week 4, as I just talked about. So 2 tough road spots in September, followed by USC at home in week 5. So Illinois could easily find themselves 2-3 very early on and then kind of tailspin from there. They also host Ohio State in week 7, which is not going to be easy, obviously. So despite returning quarterback Luke Altmaier, both of his running backs, and most of his offensive line, several pieces across the defense return as well, I just think that last year was a little bit lucky, and it's going to be hard to replicate. So while I value returning production to an extent in college football, especially in the modern era where everyone is mostly stacking their roster with transfers and it's hard to get everyone to gel, I do think there's value in it, but I prefer to target the teams that are in maybe the 10 to 30 rank in the production or returning production rankings. Illinois, just too much hype surrounding this team for a program that's not used to having that. So Illinois, I expect to underperform, unfortunately. 8.5, the win total, juiced pretty solidly to the under, though. I have them at 6-6 or 7-5. Next up is Washington, one of the tougher programs in the country to get a feel for at the moment. 2 seasons ago, went to the national championship, and then last year was a bit more of a reloading or transition year, if you will. Finished 6-7, first year under head coach Jed Fish after Kalen DeBoer went to Alabama. Brought his offensive coordinator with him from Arizona and Jimmy Dougherty, so some good coordination there. They did lose 33 transfers in total, but only 1 NFL draft pick. The returning production is relatively low, but they've done a pretty good job recruiting, bringing in the number 23 class this year and a similar number from 2 seasons ago. The transfer portal, they brought in the number 11 class 2 years ago and really have some key returning players at the skill positions. Jonah Coleman is a running back who may be the best in the Big Ten, and Denzel Boston on the outside is another really big piece to this offense. He'll have a new quarterback throwing it to him this season, DeMond Williams Jr. He did play a couple of games toward the end of last season, but takes over as the full-time starter, and he's a player I'm actually really excited to watch. A dual threat, really exciting in the run game, and can be electric in the pass game as well, as we saw in the bowl game. In the portal, they specifically targeted defense, bringing 2 guys over from Arizona a year after Fish came from there, a corner, Takario Davis, and a linebacker, Jacob Manu, as well as another linebacker from Washington State. So really focusing on the defense. Washington, I think, will be a much more stable roster and in a better position than last year. I'm not sure how much of a jump up to expect. They're still clearly in the second tier of the Big Ten, but if everything goes well and Williams is in the upper echelon of the quarterbacks in the league, there's certainly a high ceiling with this team. I have them at 8-4, but I could certainly see a win or two in either direction. Next is Michigan State. Jonathan Smith taking over last year after Mel Tucker was fired. Year 2 now, and there are more question marks, I think, than at the start of year 1. Smith, to me, I thought was a great hire. Oregon State is not a very easy place to win 10 games at, and he was able to do that. But I'm not sure the fit has really been great so far at MSU. He is obviously a West Coast guy. He brought a lot of guys with him from that area. For all his faults, Tucker was still bringing in pretty highly rated recruiting classes, as they were in the top 25 each of the last 2 years. But number 57 for this incoming class for MSU. He also just sounds a bit like a politician when he answers questions. He doesn't seem the most comfortable in his position, so maybe this year he'll adjust some and MSU will improve. But let's talk about some positives. They bring back Aiden Childs, who a year ago was the top-rated quarterback in the transfer portal, coming with his head coach over from Oregon State. Had an up and down season, I would say not bad. MSU did finish 5-7, but Childs showed some flashes of brilliance. He's just got to put it together a little bit more this year through some dreadful interceptions, especially the one to end the Boston College game. If you know, you know. But wide receiver wise, I think this might be the second or third best core in the conference. You bring back Nick Marsh, who was a real impact freshman a year ago. And then you add 2 big-time transfers in Krishan McCray, a guy I'm a personal fan of from Kent State, and then Omari Kelly, who put up really good numbers at Middle Tennessee State. So a big step up in competition for both of those guys, but I think they will have an impact. 3 receivers there that Childs can rely on, along with his tight end, Jack Velling, another guy that came over from Oregon State last year. So as far as the passing game goes, I think it should be one of the better ones in the Big Ten. As far as the overall roster, though, there's still some limits to the ceiling. The run game, they're going to be relying on a couple of transfers from lower level schools that were not quite as productive as the receivers. They have a lot of question marks across the defense as well. They lost their best player on that side of the ball to the transfer portal in cornerback Charles Brantley. But the win total is juiced over at 5.5, so the books do expect a little bit of improvement on that 5-7. I would expect that as well. Probably between 6 and 7 wins here for Michigan State if Childs progresses as expected. But as I said, pretty hard limit on the ceiling for the Spartans this season. Next, we'll go up to Minnesota, a program that has probably one of the most stable systems with PJ Fleck at the helm of the boat, as he would say. But another program here that just doesn't have too high of a ceiling. Minnesota seems to limit themselves year after year with a lack of explosion on offense, and I would expect similar results this year. They will have a great running game with running back Darius Taylor leading the charge, but they're expected to start a true freshman at the quarterback spot in Drake Lindsey. I can't say I know a ton about this kid. He wasn't super highly recruited, but when you're in a position that Minnesota is with their NIL situation, as I'm familiar with it, I guess you just don't have the type of options that some other Big Ten teams do. I kind of expect a step back here in this era. I think it's going to become harder and harder to recruit at Minnesota, and the data does lay that out. Number 35 class a year ago to now bringing in number 49 this season. They've been okay in the portal, but just not a ton of impact players. They do bring in a couple of receivers, one from Marshall, a running back from Marshall, a receiver from Miami, Ohio, and a receiver, Logan Loya, from UCLA. They have an out of conference game, an interesting one on the road in week 3 at California. That's a team that was absolutely ravaged by the transfer portal. So this one to me is one that Minnesota has to have. If they struggle in that game, that will be a real indicator for the rest of the season. They got to go to Ohio State in week 6. They go to Oregon in week 12. Both of those are probably automatic losses. But outside of that, not a ton of difficult games, a lot of coin flippy ones. So I don't have a great read on Minnesota in terms of their final result or record, but I think it could vary quite a bit. I have them between 5 and 7 wins. Next is Wisconsin. Growing up in Big Ten country, you would have never expected to see this team this low down in the odds ranking, but this is where we are. A team that really just hasn't found an identity under head coach Luke Fickell. Went 5 and 7 a year ago, and I think they may struggle to even reach that point this season. They have a really difficult schedule, including a road trip to Alabama in the non-conference. Road trips also in conference play to Michigan and Oregon, as well as hosting Ohio State. So no breaks for Wisconsin on the schedule. Difficult games throughout. They have tried to kind of transition from being a power run Big Ten classic offense to spreading it out and throwing the ball around, and it just hasn't really worked. It reminds me a lot of when Rich Rodriguez was here at Michigan. It hasn't been that bad in terms of the results for Wisconsin, but I think in time they're going to realize that their identity is running the football, having great offensive line play, and using the tight ends in the short passing game. So until they get back to that, I'm pretty much out on this Wisconsin program. They do have a relatively good amount of talent. They bring back a top 25 returning production team. The recruiting rankings, they've been in the 20s the past 2 seasons, and they bring in relatively good transfer portal classes as well. I just think the lack of identity is going to continue to hurt this team. Last year, they couldn't figure out whether they were a running team or a passing team, and ultimately they ended up being neither. Quarterback, they change over from Tyler Van Dyke, who didn't really work out, to another transfer in Billy Edwards Jr. from Maryland. He definitely has some potential, but wasn't too impressed by what I saw on the field last year. So Wisconsin, I think there's a pretty hard ceiling on them this year. It's possible that the Fickell staff will just gel very well and they'll take a big jump, but I don't see it. I actually have them going pretty solidly under the win total of 5.5. It is juiced solidly to the under, so the books agree with me there. But really rough season up there in Madison. I think we will see some changes soon. Next, we go to UCLA, a team that was kind of the odd one out of the bunch of the West Coast teams joining the Big Ten, if that makes sense. USC, Oregon, and Washington have all recently been competitors on the national scene and have all really invested heavily into their programs. UCLA is just a step behind, it seems. They have a very inexperienced head coach in Deshaun Foster, who went 5 and 7 a year ago with UCLA, which was actually better than what was expected of them. Have to give him a little bit of credit for that. He had a very interesting Big Ten Media Day a year ago that will always stick out to me, that press conference where he reminded everyone that UCLA is in fact in Los Angeles. But let's talk about the team itself that actually lost 5 picks in the NFL, surprisingly. 5 players that were good enough to play in the league, and 35 others that hit the portal. So a lot of players to replace, obviously. They bring in quite a few transfers to replace those guys, as you have to these days. Ended up with the number 20 transfer portal class overall, which is good because high school recruiting has really been one of the worst in the league for 4 years running. They do bring in the 42nd ranked class, one of their highest in a while this year. But the highlight of the transfer class is quarterback Nico Iamaleava. A very controversial, we'll say, cycle this summer between him and Tennessee, ultimately deciding to transfer here to UCLA. Personally, I wasn't as impressed by him last year as I expected to be. I thought he was really going to break out and be a Heisman contender for Tennessee and that electric offense, but he's going to have to make some more difficult reads here for UCLA. Tennessee's offense, once you nail it, there's not that many reads to make. So here in UCLA, I'm not sure how Nico's going to adjust right away, and I think it's going to limit UCLA's capabilities on offense. They do also bring in a pretty talented running back from Cal and Javian Thomas, but outside of that, not much to highlight. They lost their top receiver, J. Michael Sturdivant, to Florida, and the schedule is pretty difficult. They open with Utah in week 1. That's going to be a tough one. Utah coming off of a disappointing season, looking to make a statement. We'll talk about them in the Big 12 preview, but they also have to play Penn State. They go to Ohio State. They go to Indiana. They go to USC. And they bring in Nebraska as well. That'll be a very interesting test for that Nebraska team traveling cross country, but a big talent disadvantage there for UCLA as well. So another 5.5 win total for them. I believe it was the same number last year, or maybe 4.5, but either way, it's juiced pretty solidly to the under, expecting another rough year for the secondary program in the city of Los Angeles. Next up is Rutgers. Used to be the bottom feeder in the Big Ten, just year after year struggling to adjust to a new conference, but head coach Greg Schiano is back. He's been there for a couple of years now, and he's starting to build them up to what he had them playing like in the Big East. Last year, a 7-5 regular season, very respectable for Rutgers, and I think they might be better this year. For all the talk about Illinois returning a ton of production, Rutgers is number 6 in overall returning production and number 2 on offense. That is rare for a Scarlet Knights team that has been built on defense and physicality, but I think they may have some more explosion offensively. Ethan Kaliak-Manis has not been a guy I've been super high on at the quarterback spot, but he does come back for his second year in the same program, so he should be more familiar with the playbook, with his roster. And he's actually got 2 really good receivers to throw to. Ian Strong returns, and then they bring in DT Sheffield from North Texas, who is electric in the open field and put up some really nice numbers. They bring in some really good defensive transfers as well, 2 impact edge rushers, and the recruiting surprisingly has ramped up quite a bit as well. They've been in the 30s in the last 2 years, which doesn't sound amazing, but for Rutgers is very high up. The win total sits at 5.5, juiced to the over, and I expect them to clear that once again this year. If they can go 7-5 in year 1 with Kaliak-Manis with weaker weapons, I see no reason why they can't replicate that this year. They do have tough road games at Washington across the country, about as far of a travel spot as you can get in college football, and then at Ohio State late in the season in week 13. They host both Oregon and Penn State. If they were somehow able to pull off one of those, I think that would be probably the biggest moment in Rutgers football recent history, and that would really give them a boost heading into next season. I see Oregon as a legitimate opportunity to do that as well. We talked about the Ducks and their possible challenges on offense. That's another one that Oregon has to travel all the way across the country. We've seen some of these games be tougher based on the messed up geography of our current conferences. So some real opportunities there for Rutgers to grab a big time win, and I think 5.5 is a great number to go over. Let's talk about Maryland, a team that actually has been pretty good at bringing in quality talent over the years. They bring in the number 25 recruiting class out of high school, but they just haven't been able to do anything with that talent. Mike Loxley, for a few seasons, it seemed like, was slowly building up the program, but Last year, they took a big step back going 4-8, and now they have to replace both the quarterback and running back position with Billy Edwards and Roman Hemby both staying in the conference, as discussed earlier, with Edwards at Wisconsin and Hemby at Indiana. Maryland looks to be starting true freshman Malik Washington at quarterback. If he is as dynamic of a runner as I've been told, then maybe we'll see some exciting plays out of Maryland this year, but I think that's about it. They'll be an exciting, fun team that maybe will pull off a win or two that we don't expect. But the ceiling, again, I just don't trust this coaching staff very much, and they haven't proven it. So 4-8, that's probably too low. There's not too many other things I can highlight about this team. There were 2 transfers that I highlighted I liked. They brought in a wide receiver, Jaleel Farouk from Oklahoma. He was injured for a good portion of last year, but I think he's really talented. And then a tight end from Georgia State in Dorian Fleming, who was very productive. So 2 weapons for Washington if he's going to use his arm. But Maryland going to have a lot of games that they're an underdog in, probably every single conference game, in fact. So 4.5 is where the win total lies for this team. I see a pretty big range of possibilities for this team. I could see them anywhere between 6-6 at their ceiling to all the way down to 2-10. How about poor old Purdue? 1-11 last year, not a single conference win in sight, and I'm not sure how much better it's going to be this year. The one thing we can say about Purdue is they will be a very different team. 56 transfers in total that left the program, and they've replaced them with 54 new ones. So all new players to go with a brand new staff and head coach Barry Odom. At one point, a very highly touted coach. He's kind of bounced it around a little bit, had some success, and possibly can bring some to Purdue as well, but I highly doubt it will be in year 1. They've got a couple of choices to make between quarterback Ryan Brown, who is returning. He struggled, let's say, in his limited time on the field last season. Malachi Singleton comes over from Arkansas. We haven't seen a ton of him, but some flashes, so one of those 2 guys will be the starter there. Hard to go through a ton of different personnel, but going through some of the transfers that they lost, I was actually surprised. Some of them were really highly touted players. In total, they lost 8 4-star transfers. Now, out of 56, that's still only a seventh of them, but still some talent off of a 1-11 team. So that leaves Purdue ranking 126th in returning production, near the absolute bottom. You could say that's a good thing off of a bad team, but we just really don't know what to expect off of all of these new players, completely new roster. That being said, most of these guys are coming from smaller schools. When I was looking at the blue chip ratio for each of these teams, Purdue was one of only 2 Power 4 teams in the whole country to not have a single 4 or 5-star recruit on the roster. Devin Mockabee at running back is probably their best player, but outside of him, there are so many question marks across this roster, it's really hard to fairly grade this team. The win total across the board is either heavily juiced under at 3.5, or some books have it at 2.5. I wouldn't touch it either way. It's possible they make a slight improvement. Maybe next year we'll be on Purdue, but this year I'm laying off. Last but not least, the Northwestern Wildcats, a pretty interesting transition year last season. Had to recover from a unfortunate incident with their previous head coach, but David Braun enters year 2 with some optimism. 4-8 a season ago, but that was honestly better than they were expected to do. This year, the win total is juiced solidly to the over at 3.5, and I am in on this team. Not to the extent that I think they're going to contend for the Big Ten championship or anything, but I think Northwestern will be better than a lot of these other programs that I've talked about recently. A big reason for that is the quarterback transfer Preston Stone from SMU. I understand the quarterback change that they made over there last season. It did kind of work out for them. Obviously, SMU ended up in the playoffs, but Kevin Jennings, we saw some vulnerabilities out of him in the playoff game as well. I think Preston Stone ultimately is the better pocket passer. He may not be able to move as well, and maybe he wasn't as good of a fit for SMU's offense, but I think he's going to work out great for Northwestern. I think he could be their best quarterback in quite some time, and I love the pairing with running back. Porter has been a starter for several seasons now for Northwestern, and he's got an experienced offensive line to run behind. They didn't lose much at all. 0 NFL draft picks and only 13 total transfers. So, despite this only being year 2 under the new regime, Northwestern really able to keep most of the core together. They're number 55 overall in returning production. They just didn't have a ton of elite production from a year ago, but everybody gets another year in the system. And as I said, I love the addition of Stone to that offense. The schedule is interesting. They open at Tulane, and they're actually a 6.5 point underdog. We'll talk about Tulane in our final episode. We'll get to them a little bit, but that is a huge opportunity for Northwestern to win as an underdog against a G5 opponent, which is pretty rare, but totally respectable against a program the caliber of Tulane. They also host Oregon in week 3. Just as I was talking about for Rutgers, this is another huge opportunity for one of these teams to get a big win at home. This Ducks team early on is going to have a lot of things to figure out, and Northwestern might already have a loss. So, unique home field advantage for them as well. This year, I should mention, they don't have access to their normal stadium once again, just like last year. So, they're playing on basically a high school field right on Lake Michigan. We saw some crazy effects in some games last year, specifically against Ohio State, and that can add a lot of randomness to some of these results at home. Outside of that Oregon game, though, most of the big games are on the road at Penn State in week 7, at Nebraska, at USC, and then they do host Michigan as well very late in the year. Week 12, that might be one of the craziest weather games we see all season, but as I said, win total sitting at 3.5. I am definitely going to be on that over. I'll probably be on an alternate over as well. I did find one book that had a flat 4 on the win total at plus money. So if you can find that, I would highly recommend that. Shoot me a DM if you want the name of that book. Not going to give them free promo today, but Northwestern, generally a team I am much higher on. I think they take a big step up from where they were a season ago. All right, let's do a quick recap. As I did for the SEC episode, I'm going to give you rapid fire teams that I'm higher or lower on as a kind of a summary here. Higher on Penn State, buying all the stock that I can there. I'm taking them to win the Big Ten and possibly the national championship as well. Higher on Indiana. I think they're being slept on a year after making the playoffs. I like Washington, and I like Northwestern to exceed expectations. I'm a little lower on both Ohio State and Oregon, even though they're both the top 2 programs, some would say, in the conference. I think they may both struggle just a little bit. Most programs would still kill for the type of seasons they will probably end up with, but generally slightly lower on both of them. Lower on Illinois than the hype machine has got them pushed towards. Lower on Wisconsin as well, as much as that one feels weird to say, as I said, growing up in Big Ten country. I want to thank everybody who reached out and gave me some feedback on episode 1. I always welcome it. If you want to leave a comment under the podcast, I'll see it on the apps, specifically Spotify. I'm always available on Twitter as well, and we will be back next week for episode 3 with the Big 12. If you enjoyed the podcast, make sure you like and share it with your friends. Follow me on Twitter at DailyCFBCBB, and enjoy the rest of your day.